Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rent Prep for Landlords. It's episode number 254, and we're going to be talking about some recent topics in the news. And we got some pretty interesting stuff coming out of Berlin, and then a couple recent news stories that affect U.S. investors that you're going to want to stay on for. And we're going to get to that right after this.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. And now your hosts, Stephen White and Eric Worrell.
So, quick tease, we're going to be talking about rent control in possibly Massachusetts. So that'll be big news if you own properties over there. We're also going to be talking about a huge march that happened from Berlin activists. So we'll be discussing that. And then most importantly on this episode, we're going to spend a good amount of time with VAWA. If you're not familiar with what that is, VAWA, no, not the VAWA gas station chain, I think in New Jersey that I stopped at once, which I was very impressed with. They had these nice little screens you could, click to order food on. And this was like maybe 10 years ago. So it seemed like it's really futuristic, and now it's not at all. No, we're talking about VAWA, VAWA, and I'll explain what that is and why that matters as a landlord and what the recent news is with that. So the first story here is titled, Should Massachusetts Bring Back Rent Control? This is from WBUR.org. This is written on April 2nd by Deborah Becker and Jamie Bologna. It says here that if passed, a bill on Beacon Hill will give cities and towns the option to implement rent control. It wouldn't be a first for the state. A state ballot question ended it in the Commonwealth in 1994. I'll be honest, I don't know what that sentence means beyond that this was stopped in 1994. I won't lie to you. But it said that now State Representative Mike Connolly, a Democrat from Cambridge, is one of the bill's co-sponsors and said that the region is facing an emergency of displacement, of homelessness, of rising costs. If our bill passes, nothing would change the next day. But what would change is then cities and towns would have the ability to consider what makes sense for them. So it sounds like this isn't going to be like a statewide sweeping rent control thing, which is more so going to give the possibility for individual towns to decide what they want to do. But others like Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker say rent control won't help with high housing prices and could even make things worse. He said that rent control will stifle the production of new housing. He said that's exactly the wrong direction to go in. What we need to do here in Massachusetts is build more housing. So should the state consider bringing rent control back? Would it help curb the ever-rising prices in the Boston area, or is it the fix simply to build more? I feel like that's the question it always comes back to. We've talked about other rent control areas, Oregon doing that, and the issue of, are you discouraging people from building in that area and creating more areas, more homes that people can live in? So it's kind of interesting. If you have property in Massachusetts, I'm sure it's very interesting to you. So why don't we move forward to our next in the news article here? This one comes from ukreuters.com, uk.reuters.com. And it says that Berlin activists march to demand city seize housing from landlords. We talked about this before, but obviously this is percolating and bubbling up over there. This article is from April 6th and came from Caroline Copley. And it said that thousands of Berlin residents took to the streets on Saturday to vent anger over surging rents and demand the I knew I was going to screw this up. The expropriation of more than 200,000 apartments sold off to big private landlords, which they blame for changing the character of the city. So I had to look up expropriation. I said it right that time. And basically what that means, I'll give you the dictionary definition. It's the action by the state or authority of taking property from its owners for public use or benefit. So these citizens in Berlin, 200, it says thousands showed up. The image they have, it does look pretty busy. To give you an idea, when they show sporting events, and I saw this last year, like the Toronto Raptors were at the other teams, they're at an away game, but at home, they put up video boards for everybody to watch in the streets, and there was just thousands and thousands of people watching, and you see that sometimes at the home team or the away team doing that at their arena. It looks like that. Like there's just thousands of people lined up in Berlin. And what they want is to have 200,000 apartments sold off from big private landlords. The threshold would be that landlords who own more than 3,000 apartments, that they would take back those apartments and give them back to the people because they're afraid that these landlords are too profit centric and are creating a bad housing market. I think it said here it's changing the character of the city. So it's pretty interesting to know. I'm sure not a lot of listeners from Berlin, but if you are and you're keeping up on this, I would love to hear what's going on out there. Always drop us a line. So. This last one here, I think it's really important. It's something that I didn't know about before working at RentPrep, and I've become aware of just from hearing things. It's related to tenant screening, property management, and all that. And a lot of landlords and people in general are not familiar with VAWA, VAWA. And what that stands for is the Violence Against Women Act. So the title of this article, first I'll say it's from ACLU.org. So if you're not familiar, for almost 100 years, the ACLU has worked to defend and preserve the individual rights and liberties guaranteed by the Constitution and laws of the United States. In this particular case, it's talking about the rights afforded to women who have been exposed to violence. So again, the name of the act, the Violence Against Women Act. Well, now it's actually, it passed in the House of Representatives today, today being when they wrote this article on April 4th. And it said, today, the House of Representatives passed the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2019. This VAWA bill authorizes programs and funding that support survivors of gender-based violence, but it also does more. It tackles some of the laws and institutions that perpetuate domestic violence and sexual assault across the country. Dismantling these structural causes of gender-based violence is essential to ensuring the security and dignity of survivors, their families, and communities. So there is a bolded headline here, and it says, protecting the right to seek emergency and police assistance. This is where it really applies to landlords. It says, in cities across the country, victims of crimes increasingly pay a terrible price for calling 911, eviction from their homes. Thousands of localities have enacted ordinances that punish tenants and landlords based on calls for police or emergency services or criminal activity at a property, even when the tenant is the victim of the crime or needed aid. Those ordinances disproportionately harm survivors of domestic violence who may need to reach out for police protection repeatedly. So kind of summing that up, basically that there's ordinances or restrictions placed on tenants and even landlords where if the police are called out to the property, you are going to be penalized X, Y, Z. So it actually deters people from calling the police, and they may be worried about being evicted from their home. And it gets worse as you read the next paragraphs here. It says that once residents learn they can be evicted for calling 911, they usually lose all faith in law enforcement. Even worse, these ordinances empower abusers because they know reports to the police can result in the survivor's eviction. So think about that. If let's say there's a abusive relationship, and we'll just say it's a boyfriend abusing a girlfriend. The girlfriend is the one that's on the lease at this apartment. The boyfriend can kind of hold that over the girlfriend and say that, hey, if you call the cops, you're going to get evicted. You're not going to have a place to live. So you can see how this creates a really negative atmosphere and experience for that person that's being abused, because not only are they going through this abuse, they feel like there's nowhere they can turn because housing is so important. You don't want to lose your housing, and you can see how you'd really feel like you're just kind of caught in a vice at this point. So the ACLU has represented survivors of domestic violence who faced homelessness and escalating violence due to these local laws and advocated at the local and state levels to address their inhumane effects. The House bill recognizes the rights to report crimes and emergencies from one's homes and protect landlords, residents, and tenants from being penalized for requesting law enforcement or emergency assistance by governmental agencies that receive federal funding. While some states have enacted legislation to address this issue, a federal response is direly needed. No crime victim should be forced to make the impossible choice between suffering in silence or calling 911 and being kicked out of their homes. I think this is a great article. It makes some really interesting points because let's say your city has an ordinance that if the cops are called twice to a property, that the person's going to be evicted. Well, that's horrible for the person who lives there. That's horrible for the landlord. These type of ordinances, just like the article spells out, are going to create an atmosphere of essentially, snitches get stitches, right? If you want to use a colloquialism, that idea, right? If you are going to snitch and you're going to call the cops, you know what? You're going to be penalized for it. And that's kind of what you could really summarize this article for and what they're trying to do away with. And obviously anything that's a Violence Against Women Act is something that as people and as landlords, we want to get behind and figure out, rather than just kind of looking at the surface level of it and being like, oh, they're trying to control things or whatever, really look at why this Reauthorization Act is being presented and why it's being used to help people who are vulnerable, a vulnerable population that is feeling even more vulnerable because of the restrictions and limitations being placed on them by ordinances and the threat of being evicted. So I will link to all of these resources in today's podcast notes. So if you want to check out any of these articles in further depth, thank you to the authors who put those together. They're really interesting topics here. I hope you guys appreciate it and check those articles out. And until next week, take care and have a great week.